Elvis Presley wanted her. But Connie Stevens walked away. At the height of his fame, when every young woman in Hollywood dreamed of being the one, Connie did something almost no one else dared to do. She looked past the charm, the fame, and the promise of becoming part of his legend, and chose her own path. The world expected her to fall at his feet. Instead, she quietly rewrote the script. The late 1950s were electric. Elvis was conquering Hollywood, dazzling starlets between movie shoots, and drawing crowds that swarmed him everywhere he went. Connie, meanwhile, was Warner Brothers' rising golden girl, ambitious, adored, and fiercely managed by the studio machine. When their worlds collided, it seemed like a match written in headlines. Fan magazines buzzed, publicists prepared. But Connie saw a side of Elvis's world that few outside his circle ever understood. So what really happened between them? Why did she turn away from the most desired man in America? And why is she finally ready to tell the truth now? Before Connie Stevens ever crossed paths with Elvis Presley, she was already being shaped into one of America's most beloved faces. Born Concetta Rosalie Ann Ingoglia in Brooklyn in 1938, she grew up in a close-knit Italian-American family that valued hard work and discipline. Her early years were far removed from the bright lights of Hollywood, but even as a child, she stood out. She had a natural musicality, a sweet, clear singing voice, and a presence that made people stop and look. As a teenager, her family relocated to California, and Connie threw herself into the entertainment world with quiet determination. She joined vocal groups, performed live, and caught the attention of talent scouts. By the late 1950s, Warner Brothers had signed her, sensing star power beneath her soft features and wholesome image. They gave her a new name, polished her accent, and placed her carefully into the teen idol ecosystem that was dominating American entertainment. Television became her launching pad. She starred in Hawaiian Eye, a detective series that became a cultural hit. The role turned her into a household name, especially among young viewers who admired her combination of elegance and approachability. Teen magazines like Photoplay and Tiger Beat began printing her photo on their covers, often alongside heartthrobs like Troy Donahue, Ricky Nelson, and Fabian. Connie wasn't just an actress. She was a carefully crafted symbol of youthful innocence in a decade obsessed with clean-cut idols. This was the same era in which Elvis Presley was rewriting the rules of fame. His rise had already exploded into a cultural phenomenon by the time Connie's career caught fire. By 1958, Elvis wasn't just a singer. He was a national obsession, the most famous young man in America. Every new film role, every romantic link, every public appearance was headline news. Hollywood was abuzz with stories of Elvis's charm and his tendency to take notice of rising starlets. Connie's studio handlers understood that her image had to remain controlled. Warner Brothers saw her as a strategic figure. She could sing, she could act, and she radiated a wholesome beauty that appealed to parents and teenagers alike. Dating the wrong man, or becoming tabloid fodder, could derail everything they were building. And in 1950s Hollywood, no man attracted more scrutiny, gossip, and frenzied fan attention than Elvis Presley. When Connie's name began circulating in the same publicity circles as Elvis's, insiders took notice. She was beautiful, talented, and ascending fast. He was the king, newly immersed in Hollywood life. Their eventual meeting felt almost inevitable. But before that moment came, Connie's career was already on a meteoric climb, a climb she intended to protect. She wasn't just a starlet hoping for a fairy tale. She was a young woman carefully navigating a system built to control her image, preparing to face one of the most powerful cultural forces of her generation. By the late 1950s, Elvis Presley's world had shifted dramatically. The boy who once sang on regional radio in Memphis was now spending long stretches in California, not just to perform, but to conquer Hollywood. Movie studios saw him as a box office magnet. He brought teenage audiences with him everywhere, and executives were eager to capitalize on that power. Productions like Jailhouse Rock and King Creole proved that Elvis could hold the screen, and his growing list of film contracts meant Hollywood became his second home. But his presence in Hollywood wasn't quiet. Whenever Elvis arrived, the city felt it. Studio gates would clog with fans, photographers camped outside hotels, and gossip columnists tracked his every move. His team, later famously known as the Memphis Mafia, shadowed him constantly. They guarded his privacy, but also fueled the mystique that surrounded him. Women noticed him before he entered a room, and he noticed them too. He had a particular interest in rising starlets, especially those who carried a mix of innocence and glamour. Studio parties became the unofficial crossroads of these two worlds, Elvis's fame and Hollywood's next generation. These gatherings weren't wild public bashes. They were carefully curated social spaces, often hosted by producers, publicists, or well-connected insiders. It was in these environments that Elvis met many of the young women whose names would later be whispered in fan magazines. These were rooms filled with music executives, movie stars, dancers, and carefully scouted ingenues. And somewhere within that circuit, Connie Stevens appeared. Connie was gaining attention rapidly, and invitations to these exclusive gatherings were part of her new reality. Warner Brothers wanted her to mingle but stay composed, to be seen but never tarnished. When Elvis entered one of those rooms, surrounded by his entourage, he carried a quiet command. He wasn't loud or boisterous. People often remarked that in person, he could be unexpectedly soft-spoken, but his presence was magnetic. Eyes followed him, whispers spread, and every young woman present knew what it meant if he singled someone out. Accounts from that era describe Elvis as direct but charming when approaching women. He'd offer a warm smile, ask a few personal questions, and make the other person feel like the room had vanished. Connie later described him as sweet and very nice, remembering the impression he made on her during their early interactions. Unlike many, she wasn't dazzled into silence. She met his gaze, matched his poise, and carried herself with the self-assurance Warner Brothers had carefully instilled in her. For Elvis, Connie was different. She wasn't a background figure or a wide-eyed newcomer, she was already becoming a name. Their worlds overlapped through publicity circuits and studio circles, and before long Elvis extended a casual invitation. He wanted to see her again, not in a crowded room, but somewhere quieter. It was the beginning of a brief, fascinating connection that would take her closer to his orbit than most ever imagined. When Elvis Presley asked Connie Stevens to see him again, it wasn't with fanfare or press releases. He preferred to keep the early stages of his romantic pursuits low-key. For someone of his fame, casual meant quiet dinners away from the main strip, small private screenings, or visits to homes in Beverly Hills where only trusted friends were present. Connie accepted his invitation with curiosity, not starstruck abandon. She was already navigating a growing career. Spending time with Elvis felt like stepping into a parallel universe. Their first few outings were light and unassuming. They shared meals, exchanged stories about their upbringings, and found common ground in music. Elvis, despite his fame, could be surprisingly gentle in private. Connie later remembered him fondly, describing him as sweet and kind. What struck her most wasn't his celebrity, it was his restlessness. Even in quiet settings, he was surrounded by a small group of loyal companions, always on the move, always half in performance mode. It didn't take long for Hollywood to notice. In that era, privacy for stars of their stature was nearly impossible. Fan magazines were constantly on the hunt for new romantic pairings to boost sales, and an Elvis-Connie connection was gold. Photographers lingered outside restaurants, columnists speculated, and suddenly her name appeared beside his in print. To the public, it looked like the king had found his newest sweetheart. For Connie, the attention was startling. Until then, her fame had been carefully managed. Warner Brothers shaped every aspect of her image. controlling how she dressed, where she appeared, and who she was photographed with. Elvis lived in a completely different reality. His movements attracted mobs of fans who followed his car, crowded outside hotels, and sometimes tried to break into events just to catch a glimpse. Connie found herself at dinners where the restaurant's windows were pressed with faces, waiting to see if Elvis would emerge with someone new. She observed how everything around him functioned like a machine. There were friends who never left his side, aides who coordinated his every step, and a wall of noise that surrounded him wherever he went. It wasn't malicious, just constant. His fame was a living force that never allowed silence to last. For someone like Connie, raised in a traditional household and working under strict studio control, this kind of world was as fascinating as it was unsettling. Within weeks, whispers spread. Was Connie the next great love? Would she be joining Elvis on the road? The speculation grew louder than the reality. Behind closed doors there was no grand romance, just two young stars navigating overlapping paths. But the pressure was real. She wasn't just dating someone, she was stepping into a public storm that she couldn't fully control. And as the frenzy built around them, Connie quietly began to examine what this connection really meant for her future. Connie Stevens didn't end things with Elvis Presley through confrontation or drama. There was no headline-grabbing breakup, no bitter words exchanged in public. Instead, the connection simply began to fade, guided by a clear-eyed decision she made behind the scenes. While the tabloids dreamed up a fairy tale, Connie was weighing something entirely different: the long-term cost of stepping fully into Elvis's world. She was only in her early 20s, navigating a career that depended on precision. Every move she made reflected back on Warner Brothers, the studio that had invested heavily in her image. They saw her as a marketable star who could sing, act, and embody the wholesome ideals Americans adored at the time. A serious romantic link to Elvis would instantly shift that image. She wouldn't just be Connie Stevens, the actress, anymore. She'd be Connie Stevens, Elvis's girlfriend, and that label carried enormous weight. Her upbringing also played a role. Raised in a traditional Italian-American household, Connie had been taught to hold firm to her values and protect her reputation. Elvis's lifestyle, while thrilling to outsiders, was a constant storm of movement and attention. He traveled frequently, spent nights surrounded by friends, and lived under relentless public scrutiny. For Connie, who valued stability and career focus, that life didn't align with her goals. The moment of decision wasn't a single dramatic night. It unfolded quietly, as she recognized the gap between their worlds. Elvis was kind to her, and she admired his talent, but she sensed that being part of his inner circle meant surrendering a piece of herself. She had worked too hard to carve out her own identity, to risk becoming a supporting figure in someone else's narrative, no matter how famous he was. When she began pulling back, Elvis didn't chase or pressure her. He respected her space. Their interactions became less frequent, their outings less visible. Hollywood's gossip machine quickly moved on to the next story, leaving their brief connection as little more than a footnote in a larger cultural saga. Yet behind that quiet withdrawal was a decisive act of independence, one that few women in Elvis's orbit ever made. Many who met Elvis were swept into his momentum. Some fell deeply in love, others became entangled in his inner circle for years. Connie chose another route. She stepped away gracefully, without spectacle, and kept moving forward with her own plans. In an era when young women in Hollywood were often defined by the men they dated, she chose to define herself. It was a decision that would preserve her image, her career, and her personal sense of control. And while the world didn't notice it at the time, it marked a turning point, one that she would later look back on with clarity and pride. When Connie Stevens quietly stepped away from Elvis Presley's orbit, Hollywood didn't erupt in scandal. Instead, the moment passed almost imperceptibly, buried beneath the constant churn of gossip columns that were already scanning for the next headline. In a city where romances bloomed and faded at dizzying speed, Her decision slipped neatly between the cracks. Yet inside the industry, people noticed. Publicists, studio executives, and insiders who had watched their brief connection unfold understood the significance of what she'd done. For Warner Brothers, her choice was a relief. Linking their rising star too closely with Elvis could have complicated the careful image they were building. They wanted Connie to remain the radiant centerpiece of their television and music lineup, not a supporting character in a romance that tabloids would twist into spectacle. When the coverage began to fade, they quietly shifted their promotional efforts back to her solo projects, emphasizing her career achievements rather than her social life. Within Elvis's circle, Connie's name took on a different kind of meaning. She became the girl who didn't swoon, a rare figure who had shared a few moments with the king and then simply walked away. Some found it amusing. Others respected it. Elvis himself didn't speak publicly about their brief connection, but those close to him understood that he recognized her decision for what it was, a quiet, dignified choice. There was no resentment, no lingering drama, just mutual understanding that their paths were moving in different directions. For Connie, the aftermath was defined by forward motion. She didn't dwell on what might have been. Instead, she doubled down on her career. Her television success continued, and she expanded her presence in the recording industry, with songs like 16 Reasons, which became a hit in 1960. Her romantic life also remained under her control. She would go on to have relationships and marriages that unfolded entirely separate from the Presley narrative. The tabloids, always hungry for new stories, quickly found other targets. Elvis's love life was endlessly fascinating to the public, and new names surfaced regularly, each connection dissected, exaggerated, and sometimes mythologized. Connie's brief involvement became a footnote, overshadowed by the bigger, more dramatic romances that followed. But unlike many of those women, her career wasn't consumed by the association. In hindsight, this quiet period after their connection reveals the power of her decision. By choosing to step away without fanfare, Connie avoided becoming locked into Elvis's legend. She remained her own figure, her public image intact, her trajectory unshaken. In a Hollywood that often blurred identities, she preserved hers. And though the world moved on quickly, that small, seemingly unremarkable moment would become a defining part of how she remembered that chapter decades later, clear, calm, and entirely on her terms. As the years passed, and both their careers evolved, Connie Stevens rarely spoke in detail about her brief connection with Elvis Presley. She didn't trade on it for attention, nor did she frame it as a lost love. When she did reflect on that period later in life, her tone was consistent, warm, honest, and without embellishment. She described him as sweet, nice, and very kind, choosing words that conveyed respect rather than sensationalism. For her, that time was simply a moment when two young stars crossed paths under extraordinary circumstances. Decades later, in interviews and appearances, Connie often reflected on what it was like to be a young woman in the late 1950s, navigating both fame and intense public scrutiny. She spoke about the pressures placed on her by studios, the expectations to behave a certain way, and the constant balancing act between personal choices and professional obligations. In that context, her decision regarding Elvis wasn't presented as a grand act of rebellion. It was simply a clear, thoughtful choice made by someone who understood the weight of her own path. When interviewers brought up Elvis, she smiled softly, as if looking back on something distant and uncomplicated. She acknowledged the charm that drew so many people toward him. She also admitted that stepping into his world fully would have been overwhelming at that stage in her life. Elvis lived in a constant storm of energy and attention. She lived in a carefully managed space, still building her foundation. That difference, she explained, made her decision easy in hindsight, even if few understood it at the time. What stands out in her reflections is the absence of bitterness or regret. She didn't frame their connection as an opportunity lost or a dramatic fork in the road. Instead, she viewed it as a brief intersection, something meaningful in its own way, but never meant to define her. She admired his talent and recognized the cultural weight he carried, but she remained clear that her own ambitions and values guided her choices. In a media landscape that often thrives on exaggeration, Connie's recollections stand out for their steadiness. She didn't inflate their relationship into something it wasn't, and she didn't diminish it either. She offered her truth plainly, years after the fact when the urgency for gossip had faded and only memory remained. By the time she reached her 80s, Connie's place in entertainment history was secure: actress, singer, businesswoman, and a symbol of a bygone era of Hollywood. When she finally told the full story, it wasn't with shock or scandal, it was with perspective. A woman looking back on a youthful chapter with grace, clarity, and no need for myth-making. Looking back now, Connie Stevens' brief connection with Elvis Presley stands as a small but striking moment in both of their stories. It wasn't a headline romance, and it didn't alter the course of pop culture in an obvious way. Yet its quiet significance has grown clearer with time. In a world where many young women around Elvis were swept into his orbit, Connie's decision to step back remains unusual. She didn't challenge him publicly or seek to make a statement, she simply chose herself. That choice preserved something rare in Hollywood: her independence. Many women who entered Elvis's personal world became permanently tied to his legacy. Their identities, careers, and public images were often defined by their connection to him. Connie avoided that entirely. Her career continued on its own track: hit songs, acting roles, and eventually business ventures that secured her financial stability. She became known for her work, not for being part of someone else's narrative. Elvis's story moved on too. His romantic life would be filled with high-profile figures, complicated relationships, and lasting legends. Connie's chapter is brief and understated, but precisely because of that, it offers something different: a glimpse of what it looked like when someone chose not to be absorbed by the phenomenon. Her story shows that even at the height of his power, there were women who interacted with Elvis as equals, not just admirers. For her fans, and for those who study that era of Hollywood, this perspective adds texture to both of their legacies. Elvis remains the cultural giant, the figure whose personal life was often as scrutinized as his art. Connie represents the counterpoint, the young woman who crossed paths with him, saw his world for what it was, and walked her own road. In many ways, that decision says as much about the era as it does about her character. In later years, as Connie told her story with calm honesty, audiences found themselves unexpectedly captivated. Not because it was scandalous, but because it was human. It revealed how much quiet agency existed behind the glossy surfaces of 1950s Hollywood. It showed that not every story about Elvis had to end in heartbreak, myth, or tragedy. Some ended simply, with mutual respect and a life lived on one's own terms. Today at 87, Connie's reflections carry a weight they might not have decades earlier. Time has given her story context. It isn't just about a moment with a superstar. It's about identity, choice, and the quiet strength of knowing when to step away. In an industry built on legends, Connie Stevens left hers intact. Connie Stevens' story with Elvis Presley isn't about scandal or heartbreak. It's about a young woman who, at the height of America's obsession with the king, quietly chose her own path. She didn't seek headlines or try to rewrite history. She simply looked at the whirlwind surrounding him and decided to step away. Decades later, her honesty gives us a rare, grounded glimpse into a world often clouded by myth. It's a reminder that even in the glow of a cultural giant, personal choice matters. For more emotional stories, check out this video.